Hello there. I'm Norma Levy, president of New Plaza Cinema. We're a nonprofit organization. Today we'll be discussing a terrific 1958 thriller called Vertigo, directed by Alfred Hitchcock and starring Jimmy Stewart and Kim Novak. And now it's my great pleasure to turn this over to our curator and host, Gary Palmucci. Gary?
Okay, thank you, Norma. Well, it's an honor to be here with this cadre of Hitchcock and Vertigo experts this afternoon, although I'll be playing mostly a supporting role, as is often the case, running back and forth between screenings and other operations here at New Plaza Cinema. But Vertigo played a central role in my first decade of Hitchcock education, which started in the early 70s, mainly because it was one of his key films. Some would say the key film, his artistic testament, but was mostly at that time impossible to see, as he had decided to take it and several other of his films off the market to allegedly increase their eventual resale value. After a final airing on CBS TV in early 1973, it was not available until a theatrical re-release a decade later. A very frustrating decade for a generation of budding Hitchcockologists like myself. After hearing too late about occasional special screenings like Jimmy Stewart tributes at the AFI in 1976, the George Eastman House in 78, I finally saw it via a hot tip from a friend one November night in 1980 at SUNY Purchase in a film class taught by revered Professor Tom Gunning. That was the same week that Raging Bull and Heaven's Gate premiered in New York City, a week of moviegoing that I'll never forget. Now, our team will be covering a lot of ground today, but I guess one thing that always springs to mind for me is how Jimmy Stewart in this film, as I believe Truffaut and others have noted, is like a great silent movie star in much of Vertigo. There are dozens and dozens of shots of him just looking, reacting, yearning, agonizing, behind the wheel of a car, on a stepladder, in Judy Barton's room, waiting for her to come out of the ladies, on the roof of Mission San Juan Bautista, which I've visited, and maybe some of our guests have too. Max, does the trailer you've chosen speak to this?
So the trailer I'm going to share with you is the original 1958 trailer that a rather panicked Paramount Pictures released because they weren't sure if the title Vertigo would be marketable or understandable at all to the general public. So it's one of my favorite trailers of the period because they're really trying to educate the public about what this unusual word that wasn't widely heard or mentioned in a film title is all about. Here's the original trailer.
Vertigo, a feeling of dizziness, a swimming in the head. Figuratively, a state in which all things seem to be engulfed in a whirlpool of terror, as created by Alfred Hitchcock in the story that gives new meaning to the word suspense.
I don't want to die. There's someone inside me, and she says I must die. Scotty, don't let me go.
A beautiful girl haunted by the desperate, unexplainable urge to destroy herself. A man possessed by the paralyzing vertigo that made him afraid of high places.
Easy now.
Oh, no. Well, this is a cinch. Here, I look up, I look down. I look up, I look...
What was the strange attraction that brought these two together in spite of the dark forces that tore them apart? The specter from the past that drew her to the ancient headstone in the Mission graveyard. The compulsion that drove her relentlessly to the point of no return. The story of a love so powerful it broke down all barriers between past and present, between life and death, between the golden girl in the dark tower and the tawdry redhead that he tried to remake in her image.
If I let you change me, will that do it? If I do what you tell me, will you love me?
Yes.
All right. All right, then I'll do it. Because I don't care any more about me.
So there are some funny examples we can share later, thanks to the excellent Dan Euler book about Vertigo, The Making of Vertigo, which came out in the 90s, this book about some of the other titles that Paramount recommended Hitchcock use. He was at the height of his powers when he made this film, and our guest who's going to join us shortly, Stephen Smith, can tell us more about that. But at Paramount, he was given unprecedented control over his work thanks to his agent Lou Wasserman pushing the deal through, in which he could control everything from that right down to the final cut. Although there were issues with that. What was your reflection of upon seeing Vertigo again, Gary?
Well, I think another thing that occurs to me, and this is not, I'm not the first person to have said this, but I think I was kind of tuning out the plot in some ways, or just not. I think we've kind of stopped having any question about the plot being believable over dozens of screenings over times. But I think there's many other things to look at. The feelings, the moods, the visual design, and all of that is so rich. Perhaps it's not as perfect a piece of emotional or cinematographic construction as some of his other films. I think my all-time favorite is still Notorious, because it's about the feelings and the emotions. And
well, it has been the subject of debate since its original release about several aspects of the narrative. Well, first of all, the fact in the very beginning, we have to suspend disbelief when we see James Stewart's Scotty Ferguson hanging from the gutter. And then we fade out and we fade into Barbara Bel Geddes' apartment, and he's recuperating. How did he get down from there? So already you have to suspend belief at the very beginning.
well,
And then there were
Hitchcock might have said,
Right.
Max, that's something for our friends, the plausibles, or something. That was one of his.
Exactly. And then there was the matter of tremendous controversy, which Stephen Smith is going to talk more about, is the reveal, in which we find out quite a ways into the movie what actually is going on here, involving the Judy character versus the Madeline character. And was that a mistake? Was that a good thing to reveal that information? And then which part works better? Some of us like the first poetic section with Madeline and Scotty more than that last 35 minutes, but it's one of those elements. These are several elements that I think make the film continue to be talked about and debated. And
Well,
I think it'd be a good time to bring Stephen Smith in. Here, our
yes.
special guest today, before we hear from Dan Cahill, who's going to talk about the cinematographic look of Vertigo. Stephen C. Smith, I have to keep this short because the last time I tried to do justice, he said, please stop. So he's so modest. He's an Emmy-nominated documentary producer. He's written 2 acclaimed biographies, music by Max Steiner, and a book, A Heart at Fire Center, The Life and Music of Bernard Herrmann, very relevant to Vertigo. He's been nominated for Emmys for his documentary work. And needless to say, Stephen Smith, welcome back to New Plaza Cinema Online.
Well, thank you so much, Max and Gary. It's terrific to be with you. And yes, I'm undertaking another Hitchcock book project at the moment. More about that in a year or so, maybe. But it's a pleasure to speak about Vertigo, since I had the opportunity to interview people who worked on the film, who were around the film, who knew Hitchcock, and certainly a lot about the music. But I just wanted to mention that Vertigo was one of the most difficult scripts to realize. It took many, many months and many drafts to have this come together. And your discussion of the implausibility of some of it reminded me of how Hitchcock struggled to find the right balance between the dreamlike quality that he wanted, and really, I think, the emotions that he wanted, and the rather personal themes of control and loss of control, which was one of Hitchcock's greatest fears, that he brilliantly suppressed through that persona of his. And it wasn't until they brought on a writer named Samuel Taylor at sort of the, if not 11th hour, the 10th hour. And he's the one who created the character of Midge, played by Barbara Bel Geddes. He's the one who created a script that Jimmy Stewart signed off on, because Stewart just kept saying, you know, this doesn't, it isn't plausible. This doesn't make sense. I don't know how to play this person. And Midge, I think, was such a key to that. And Taylor was also a San Franciscan who could bring a lot of that specificity that Hitchcock wanted. And that's something that Hitchcock, I don't think people realize how hard Hitchcock worked to get the sounds right of ringing telephones in a certain city, or the sounds of a city, and then make tremendous, wild, irrational story leaps. But he wanted something that was both dreamlike and rooted in reality, because, as he liked to say, dreams and nightmares always feel real to us. And Vertigo is an example of that. And something else worth mentioning is it's the first and maybe the only time that Hitchcock really set out to make a commercial art film. There really wasn't such a thing as an American art film in the 50s, but at this time, French critics were starting to give him the respect that he privately felt he had been denied by American critics who wrote him off as a showman. He was very, very happy to have the great success and great financial rewards of his television series that began 2 years before he shot Vertigo. But again, I think that also made him feel inside, I'm not being appreciated as a filmmaker. And we'll often see posters for Vertigo that say Alfred Hitchcock's masterpiece. And I thought that was a poster from re-releases. That was the original poster. So he really set out to try to convey to people that this was a film that had aspirations beyond merely being entertaining. And I think he believed that the casting of James Stewart and Kim Novak would give him the ability to get the audience in. And it as we know, it didn't lose money, but it was not the great success. It was a break-even movie, and it found its audience later. And I think Hitchcock was very, very disappointed people didn't appreciate it more at the time, and he would be gratified by the reaction to it that most people feel today, although it is still a controversial title, and some that a number of people don't like, and that's okay.
Question for you, Stephen, since you've interviewed so many people that had been associated with the film, did you get a sense from them whether at the time they were making it, they knew they were making something really extraordinarily different from anything they'd done before? Or was it just a job and they were taken aback by this unbelievable recognition it has as a major contribution to world cinema?
Well, that's a great question. They certainly didn't feel the latter, that they were making, a great film for all time. What they were really trying to do for about a year was make a film that could be produced and shot. They really, forgive me for repeating myself, but they really struggled to have it make enough sense to have it have the kind of great narrative leaps that it does. I'm happy to go along with it, but I have often thought to myself, surely an ex-cop and a private detective like Scotty Ferguson would look up a picture of Madeline and realize that he's following the wrong woman. But Samuel Taylor, that screenwriter I mentioned, said years later, when the film was a great success, and happily he lived to see it have that success, said something to the effect, and this is a paraphrase, that they took a story that was illogical to convey a story that had truths, that had emotional truths about the manipulation of women by men. Not that he articulated all these, but so many of the themes that people find in Vertigo, the irrationality of passion, and all the other things that Vertigo can be said to be about. So, but they knew it was special to Hitchcock. And Hitchcock spent a lot of time with his brilliant and still underrated cinematographer, Robert Burks, going over paintings by Vermeer and really talking about shot for shot what he wanted to see in the movie visually. And it's also the first film, I think, where Hitchcock and his, again, brilliant and underrated editor, George Tomasini, where they were editing the film knowing that Bernard Herrmann was going to score, not just write theoretically a terrific score, but write a very Hitchcockian score. And I think that Hitchcock would have cut the scenes of Stewart driving to be much shorter had he not known that Bernard Herrmann was on the film, because he and Herrmann, before a writer was assigned to the movie, he and Herrmann were talking about what the movie was about. That's how close those two men were, that Benny, as he was called, was on this movie for about 2 years. He spent 2 months perhaps writing the score, but he spent 2 years talking about it with Hitchcock. And I find that remarkable. And there's a great story that I believe is true. Herrmann loved to tell it, which is that when it came to the scene where Judy becomes Madeline, where she reveals herself in that wonderful ghostly light in the apartment to Scotty, that Benny, who was visiting the set, as he often did, Herman said, "We will just have the camera and you." And he liked to flatter his collaborators, but that's pretty much what he did. There's no dialogue from the time that she appears as Madeline again. And again, he was so confident, rightly, that Herman was going to deliver the goods and create something spectacular that he allowed the film to be long. And it's one of Hitchcock's longest films to that time. And the rhythms of it are strange. You can't break it down into a 3-act structure the way movies are now. Quite the same.
Very true, because you open with that tremendously dramatic scene on the rooftop with Ferguson and the policeman pursuing that felon across the roof and the tragedy that takes place, all visual. Then
Right.
you have two very dialogue intensive scenes that follow. The scene in Midge's apartment, where there's a lot of backstory and a lot of explanation, a lot of talking. Then we go to Galvin Elster's office, where once again, there's a lot of talking going on, compelling talking, but a lot of talking. And then we go into that extraordinary dialogueless montage that starts at Ernie's, the restaurant, and we follow Scotty following Madeline. And a few of us were talking about this earlier, that there was a copy of one of the final draft of Vertigo, and it was called From Among the Dead, that was circulating around. And I noticed in this shooting script, the scene in Galvin Elster's office originally was to have continued with Elster in voiceover talking about his wife and how she was seduced by San Francisco. And it's a long passage of dialogue that was
Yes.
supposed to have taken place over the Ernie sequences.
Right.
And I'm so grateful that Hitchcock and said, okay, we've had enough talk now. We need, because imagine how the impact would have been lost. That magnificent scene where Kim Novak makes her appearance. You don't
It's it,
need that narration.
You're exactly right, Max. They decided, Herman and Hitchcock, and really everyone decided that there was a world of reality and a world of dreams for a lot of this film. And I love the way that they compress the exposition into those scenes. Psycho is the same way. And you really notice it if you go to see the film shown with the score played live by an orchestra. And I don't generally think those work very well because concert halls are built acoustically different from movie theaters. So they usually turn the subtitles on the Blu-ray they're showing or the DCP of the film that they're showing just so people can hear the dialogue. But because both Vertigo and Psycho concentrate so much of the exposition into scenes that aren't scored, and then have these lengthy, reels almost. There's an entire reel practically without dialogue. Hitchcock absolutely wanted the music and the rhythms and the editing to have a sort of hypnotic trance-like effect on people. And it certainly does, I would say, for many people.
Absolutely. And Stephen, perhaps you can correct a myth here, because in the very famous interview that Truffaut did with Hitchcock, he indicated, well, there were two French novelists who wanted you to make one of their books into a film, and so they wrote Vertigo and with the hope that you would buy it. And Hitchcock didn't know that. And Dan Euler, in his book, shoots that theory down. Anything to add? I have not read the novel. I believe Dan, who's coming up shortly, has. But anything to add to that?
No, I'll just say that I think Dan Euler's book is superbly researched.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
a tremendous tool. I think anyone who loves Vertigo should own this book. It really takes you on the set each day and takes you through post-production in a wonderful way. So I have full faith in Dan's research on that point. I will say that a film that I'm sure you have shown, Diabolique, by Clouzot, who was being called the Gallic Hitchcock or the French Hitchcock. Certainly both Psycho and Vertigo, I think, owe a nod to the fact that Clouzot was getting attention. And Hitchcock, one thing that's interesting about Hitchcock that most people don't know is he rarely cited other films or filmmakers, and sometimes
Right.
very disingenuously acted as if he didn't even know what was coming out. Well, you can go to the Margaret Herrick Library in Los Angeles, where his family, and I'm so grateful they did, have donated his papers and the production files. And it is astonishing how many contemporary films, from musicals to comedies to thrillers, that were coming out, and European cinema that Hitchcock was privately having screened, either at his very nice offices at Paramount or his palatial offices later at Universal with his private screening room and dining room. But he was looking at everything that came out, but then kind of, like to project the notion that he was sui generis, that everything just came out of his own, idea. And that's fine. That was part of his approach. But I think he was very keen to what other people were making, to answer your question, but only made things that he really believed in. And it's astonishing to me that for that great period of the 50s, that every year there's a Hitchcock movie coming out, and so many of them are great. They range from good to great, I think.
And as you had indicated when we chatted the other day, it's amazing that a movie was coming out every year, because this film was made under a lot of problems. There were health
Yes.
crises in the Hitchcock household. Hitchcock
Yes.
had two situations going on. His wife became ill for a while, and he
Yes.
was inactive for a while, but yet he was still making this one picture a year.
Exactly. Yeah, nothing could stop him. I mean, even though Hitchcock once said, when asked to describe his idea of bliss, I think he said a perfect horizon. I'm paraphrasing. He was a workaholic, and he always made sure that one film was well into development while he was shooting another. So while he was filming Vertigo, Ernest Lehman was busy putting the finishing touches on North by Northwest, and incredibly, at the same time, then Norman Lloyd and Joan Harrison would come over from from Universal and run all the scripts of the TV show past him, or at least the premises. They would boil down the episodes usually to a page, or they'd say, "Here are the ones we think you'd like to direct this season." So he thrived on that kind of work, and I think it was only possible because, as anyone in any field knows, you need a great team. And he had a team of absolute all-stars, and arguably they're at their peak here and on North by Northwest. And he varied a little for Psycho by using mostly his television crew that did a superb job. But even then, he kept two people from his movie team, the editor George Tomasini and Bernard Herrmann, because he wanted to make sure that that he had them for the post. But yeah, you're seeing Hitchcock at the height of his powers, and certainly with Vertigo, I think using all of the collateral that you build up as a successful commercial filmmaker to do something that might be non-commercial, and certainly proved to be, to a certain extent in its day.
I just can't imagine working on a film like Vertigo as a director and multitasking with other projects. How could you even distract yourself? I mean, that's just, there's so much in Vertigo that demands 100% of our attention. Before we get to Dan, I was reminded, you said that he screened a lot of films. One of them, I would imagine, would have had to have been Pushover with Kim Novak and Fred McMurray, that Richard Quine directed,
Mhm.
because it shows her, it's an excellent suspense noirish picture that's a good vehicle for her, and
Yeah, yeah.
it was
Yeah, that I don't there were so many movies. I wish I could remember them all off the top of my head. I don't remember that was officially listed, but certainly he would have looked at Kim Novak films, because he was reluctant. Well, he was disappointed, let's say, in her hiring, and he seems to be one of the very few, if not only ones, who was. Everybody was thrilled. Paramount was thrilled. He never gave her, though. I think he so strongly envisioned Vera Miles, who was his protege at the time in that role, that when she had to leave the production, and then a far more bankable star like Kim Novak came in, he just never could quite accept her in the role. And I have to say that when Vertigo didn't make money, he kind of privately threw Jimmy Stewart under the bus a little bit, saying that Stewart was too old. At the same time, he maintained a good relationship with Stewart, who had a piece of this movie, incidentally, just like he did on Rear Window. And they were friends, they were good colleagues. But both Bernard Herrmann, and then after the film's release, Hitchcock felt that James Stewart was too old, or it wasn't right to cast him in this role. I completely disagree. But again, part of the fun of Vertigo is that it elicits very strong feelings. I remember taking friends to, when it was re-released finally in 1983, to see it. We were college students, and I was already in love with it and had seen it several times, was getting ready to write my book on Herman. They hated it because to them it was just illogical, it was bizarre, and it made me aware for the first time that this was not a film for everyone.
Everybody's reaction is different. And also, as I maybe indicated earlier, it's different at different times of your life when you see it.
Very much
I've noticed
so.
that. It's like
Very much so.
it's strange,
And I,
it's harrowing,
yeah,
it's touching, it's what the heck.
yeah.
So
And
we
Hitchcock,
yeah,
yeah, forgive me, I'll just say last
please.
thing that Hitchcock would jokingly say that he followed the saying of, I forget which French playwright, torture the women. But you have to say, and certainly Judy Barton is tortured to the extreme in this, and is the real tragic character as well, I think. But at the same time, you look at Hitchcock's films, and he created arguably more sympathetic women who are victorious than any filmmaker of his time from the 1920s through the 1970s. So his depiction of women is extremely complex, and it's never more complex than in this film.
And also, I mean, Jimmy Stewart's character is pretty tortured too. I mean, in his
Yes.
own, he's carrying his own demons. Wonderfully stated, though. Let us now invite our cinematography expert and filmmaker, Daniel Cahill, to discuss the visual look of Vertigo, which was a Paramount picture in VistaVision.
Now, the first image in this film is this, and it's superimposed almost over Hitchcock's credit. And I remember with the first time I saw this, not knowing what am I looking at? And then suddenly, in almost a jump scare shot, we see this hand grab the rung of a ladder. And thus begins the chase. And the chase culminates in what people now refer to as the vertigo effect. This is when Stewart is hanging from the gutter and he looks down below him. And the effect here, I'll show you back and forth. This is the final frame. This is the starting frame, final frame. It's achieved by zooming the camera lens in one direction, i.e. in, and dollying the camera backwards, in this case, in the opposite direction, out. I think they interchange some of those effects, zoom out and dolly in. But this was kind of influential. This is a favorite scene of mine, and I'll tell you why, just because it's got an intriguing visual aspect to it. You notice this is at the Argosy Hotel, sorry, Argosy Bookshop, excuse me. And there is also an Argosy Bookshop in Manhattan, which figured in Martin Ritt's film, The Front, which we did a talk back on. But this is another one, and it's kind of dark, and it's late afternoon. And as they're talking with Pop Liebel about how dark Carlotta Valdez's life was, it gets darker still. And finally, they say goodbye to Pop and they go outside, and it's twilight out there. But you notice now that Pop has illuminated the light inside his bookstore. I don't know why I love this film, this scene so much. There's just something very real world about it that doesn't often creep into Hollywood films, and I like that. For those of us who know San Francisco and love the bridge, this couldn't be any more beautiful. The colors are perfect, the lines of the bridge, Madeline's posture. This is at what they refer to as Old Fort Point in right on the bay, and it doesn't look like that now, but I will not drag us away from this lovely fantasy image. Many of you know that this bell tower is totally fake. It doesn't exist at the San Juan Bautista mission. But this in itself is a very curious shot. It's an angle that I'm going to make a reference now to Hitchcock's Catholicism. This could be God's pitiless viewpoint on what has just happened. Over here to this side of the frame, you see the priest being climbing up a ladder to investigate what's going on. And what takes a long time to notice is right down here in the lower foreground, this is an archway through which the guilty Jimmy Stewart has emerged, and he lingers there casting a shadow. This is sort of Hitchcock's way of saying, yeah, this man is in desperate trouble for what he has started. Here we see Jimmy Stewart so depressed that he can't speak. And Midge clearly is very concerned about him. I often like to call Jimmy Stewart good old Jimmy Stewart because he was every man for his generation. And here he has really gone for a fall. And here is another iconic image. Midge has just left from a very unsatisfying interview with his shrink, and she is walking down a lonely hallway with not knowing what to do about her friend Scotty. Here we are as Madeline is emerging from her Judy persona, and this is not just green light, but it's sort of a misty green, which almost takes you into a supernatural realm here. Now, this is on the way to the mission. Scotty has figured out that there's some sort of plot here because she made the mistake of wearing the necklace. And I want to call your attention to the road here. This is, by all obvious things, this is an establishing shot showing the road that they're driving on in a very wide angle. It is a single 2-lane road. And notice the point of view from the windshield as he's driving on the wrong side of the road in this shot. There are many explanations for this that I've encountered. One person said, oh, it was really a divided highway. Well, you don't see that in the establishing shot. It's clearly a normal 2-lane road. I think it's there to create tension in a very subtle way. He's trying to, get Judy to confess to what the plot was, and he's driving on the wrong side of the road. Here we have the finale of the film, another very emotional shot for me. Here is a man whose life is, well, disrupted once again. And it's a very sad image. His posture is weakened. And what I find most touching is the fact that right here, his necktie is gently blowing in the breeze.
It's funny because Hitchcock was known for not liking to film on location. He liked having the studio control, but he uses locations brilliantly whenever he uses them. Would
In
you agree,
particular,
Stephen?
Yes, he loved the idea of locations, and he didn't mind doing it for the important shots. But as anyone who's made a movie outside knows, or or even just tried to have a conversation on a phone outside knows, you cannot control the elements. And I really think that the core issue in Hitchcock's life, one of his greatest fears and what his films are about, is loss of control and knowing that we feel the same thing. So, and you know, I sometimes when you watch the films, there's rear screen projection, and a younger audience sometimes chuckles. But I'm just thinking, it shouldn't matter. I mean, it certainly works for me. And if you were working today, the technology is better, but I don't think the screenplays are, and I don't think we have Alfred Hitchcock's today. So I'll take the trade-off, even when we can tell the occasionally imperfect matching of location and set, it doesn't bother me. And music, I think, goes a long way in helping. That was something that Herman realized, was to take different elements of the separate pieces of film and, as he would say, make it feel like a seamless whole.
Well, if I may be a little catty towards moviegoers today, it's easy to snicker about a rear projected image in a Hitchcock movie from 70 years ago. And at the same time, people will go and see the most phony looking computer generated images of phony water, phony mountains that were all created by computers. I think they look awful.
Yeah.
And I know audiences of the future will be laughing even more uproariously than I do at that. So.
Some people have referred to this film as a love letter to San Francisco, and I think it clearly is. He very much enjoyed the town.
Well, that stunning sequence during that wordless montage when he's following Kim Novak around San Francisco, and she visits the grave of Carlotta Valdez. Those of us seeing that for the first time sometimes note that, it's interesting that the filters that were used by Hitchcock to give that a very soft glow, there were no filters in front of the camera lens. Apparently the lighting was exactly the way it appeared in the finished film. And I didn't believe that until once again the Euler book reprinted one of Peggy Robertson's production report page. Peggy Robertson was Hitchcock's secretary, in which she's listing the lenses and the time of day they were filming, and there's no mention of any filtration being put in front of the camera lens to give that dreamlike glow in that sequence. That was just
I am one of the ultimate Vertigo devotees who, on just about each of my many business trips to San Francisco, I would try and hit at least one location. And I've been to the Mission Dolores there and been in that graveyard. And it's really evocative, you know? You go, oh, yeah, they did it here.
Stephen, you had mentioned something about the fact that there was some editing done to the film before it was released to the theaters, but they showed a different version to the critics, and there was what happened? What was all that about?
Well, the people may not know, and it's again, I can't help but say again, Dan Euler's book goes into this in great detail. Herbert Coleman was Hitchcock's associate producer and really co-producer on these films, and he played an important role in getting the films executed properly and problem solving. And he gives perhaps the most vivid account of what I'm going to tell you briefly in his autobiography, The Man Who Knew Hitchcock. But basically, Hitchcock, as we know, liked to say that he didn't make mysteries, he made suspense films. And when the final writer on Vertigo, the one who really made it all come together, Samuel Taylor, he said to Hitchcock, you know, we really, to make this a true Hitchcock film, don't you feel we need to let the audience know ahead of Scotty that Judy and Madeline are the same woman? And Hitchcock agreed, and they tried different ways of explaining that, and they settled on what Bernard Herrmann called in his music cue, the letter scene. It works for me just fine, but apparently neither man was satisfied completely with it, but they felt it worked. And again, it's so visual. I love how she goes to the closet, and then we see the visuals of what happened while we hear Bernard Herrmann's churning music that accompanies every single climb and fall in the film. Well, that was the way. So Hitchcock shot that scene that we know, and it was previewed for some critics and by one of the top executives at Paramount. And then at more than the 11th hour, as reels of film were being shipped out, probably it was Joan Harrison, but Herbert Coleman thought that Joan Harrison, who had been Hitchcock's assistant and then the producer of his TV series, felt that scene revealing that Judy and Madeline were the same was a terrible mistake. And Hitchcock listened to someone who told him that and decided he wanted that scene cut out so that the audience, he felt, would realize that Judy and Madeline were the same only when Scotty finds it out, very close to the end of the film. So that scene was taken out, and there was a big music cut. There was an edit. It wasn't, but that was done. And then some more film reels were reel, whatever that was, 8 or 9 was redone. And then Hitchcock, who had a contract at Paramount that was, I will say, virtually unprecedented, because I think it was unprecedented in Hollywood. So, but just in case, I'll say virtually, in having so much control over his films. He was overruled by Paramount because the film had been shown to critics with the scene of revealing that Judy and Madeline were the same. So he was ordered by the heads of Paramount to put that scene back in. And Herbert Coleman, the producer, was begging him to put that scene back in. And Hitchcock agreed, and more money was spent making new reels sent out. So there was a lot of confusion right before the film premiered. And fortunately, I think, you know, that scene was put back in. It has wonderful music, but most critically, it makes us see that whole last 25 minutes of the movie totally differently. It allows us to change our allegiance, I think, even though she's a conspirator and a murderer, co-conspirator, our sympathies, I think, are with Judy as we watch Scotty become totally unhinged and become a character type that I've learned is all too familiar to a number of women, especially who've had very controlling men doing things like that. And it's fascinating that Hitchcock encourages us to separate from James Stewart, from our leading man, and then we're as unmoored as he is by the end of the movie. I'm really amazed Paramount agreed to the film, and And would it have been more successful with that scene cut? Probably not, because you'd still be left standing on that ledge hopelessly with Scotty Ferguson at the end. And there was a little epilogue that was shot, and Max, as you pointed out, it's in the original screenplay where Scotty goes back to, and we see Midge one last time, and Scotty is in just as shocked a state as he is on that ledge. And a very clumsy radio announcer tells us that Gavin Elster has been arrested. Well, I am convinced that that was never intended to be used by Hitchcock. Herbert Coleman said it was not intended to be used ever. And I think what they did to satisfy Jeffrey Sherlock, the censor, was to underline in crayon, that yes, everybody's punished. Gavin Elster is arrested, the main conspirator behind the murder, because as far as we know, he's left for another country and it goes unpunished in the final film. But fortunately, Hitchcock being Hitchcock and the censors loosening up, the final censor board didn't require them to use that ending. And I believe that Hitchcock always intended, you just look at that last shot of the movie. That's the end of the movie.
How
That
could
tells you
possibly
everything.
top that?
Stephen, was that ending not seen until the home video releases in the late 1990s? That's
Yeah, that's my understanding that there's, to my knowledge, never been a film print of it, nor did, Herbert Coleman initially didn't even think they'd shot it, and then it was shown to him, when the film was issued on video, so I do not believe it was ever used. I mean, Hitchcock would not have wanted that used. There's no music Bernard Herrmann could have written to make that ending work either, and I think it's telling that. And Daniel, I'm so happy you showed that shot of Midge walking down the hospital corridor, because that's the moment when she leaves the movie. And I think that's the other reason why I feel that ending that was shot, the tag, if you will, in her apartment was never intended to be used, is that when Midge walks away down that long hall, we don't know it when we first watched the movie, but that's when she leaves us. And she was invented to be the audience surrogate. She was invented to be the person to say, oh, come on, what's going on here? And as you said, as Max said, to have Scotty talk with someone. And Daniel, you said to have Scotty talk to someone. When she walks away, we're lost. There goes our person who's questioning all of this. We're left with two very damaged people.
And Stephen, someone who is usually pretty credible to me used to insist to me that on certain television airings of Vertigo, they would cut that scene. I don't think Mozart's going to help, just because it enabled the film just to fit in a 2.5-hour slot with commercials. Does that sound right to you?
Well, I believe you, and I was never fortunate enough, or maybe unfortunate enough, if it was cut, to see Vertigo on television. I had to wait and see a surreptitious screening. It was one of those movies where somebody would smuggle a print, and you'd get a secret word that it was showing somewhere. Where I saw it about a year or two before the re-release in '83. But yeah, it does make sense that the movie is 127, 128 minutes. That in those days. That would mean you'd cut about 7 minutes out of a movie to get it in 2.5 hours with commercials. So yeah.
It's a relief that this film.
Share
Go ahead, Dan.
just one experience that I had in film school in 1976. I was taking a class in cinema studies on German silent cinema from a scholar named William Rothman. I don't know if his name is well known to you guys, but at one point in this class, he referenced Vertigo. And I raised my hand and said, Vertigo, we can't see Vertigo. And you're referring to it like you've just seen it. And he said, the Library of Congress. But you have to credential yourself to get them to show it to you. So once again, I had to shrug it off for another 6 or 7 years. Until
I was told they had stopped that also, Dan, at a certain point, because too many people were asking to see it and they were going to wear out the print. That was
exactly.
May I tell one very short? Sorry, Gary. May I tell a 1-minute story about a special screening of the movie that happened in 1959, just about a year after it came out? The young Joseph Stefano, pretty much a neophyte screenwriter with just a couple of credits under his belt, was writing Psycho for Hitchcock. And for some reason, he said that he wanted to see Vertigo. I don't know if he hadn't seen it or wanted to see it again. And Hitchcock arranged a screening of it in Hitchcock's private screening room. And Hitchcock would never watch his films again. So Stefano watched it on his own. And then later, when he saw Hitchcock, he said, and I'm sorry, I don't have the words in front of me, but he said, that was such a beautiful film. And I can tell what a personal movie that was for you. And he said that Hitchcock almost burst into tears, that he was so emotionally overcome. And
That's
and for
amazing.
a man who, you know, really repressed both his fears, his crying, his yelling. It was very infrequent that he lost control of his emotions. And he'd write letters to Herman and certainly Truffaut saying, "I'm in tears as I read your letter," you know. So there was a very sensitive person behind that persona that we all see. And I think Vertigo is the clearest expression of it in his films.
Have you guys spoken about the proposed remake of Vertigo with Robert Downey Jr. that's been talked up a lot recently?
Oh, God, no,
We
please.
haven't. I think it's.
I
Save
thought
it.
I thought it was a joke at first, but apparently not.
Well, he did so well with Dr. Dolittle. Why not do Vertigo? Sorry.
I just want to mention that our next talk back next month will be a Truffaut film. Literally Shoot the Pianist, but we know it as Shoot the Piano Player. And on the 21st of February, I will be doing an encore of my Francois Truffaut lecture.
Barbara Turk, can you speak a little more about the script and how adding the Midge character, a marvelous Barbara Bel Geddes, made it more acceptable both to Jimmy Stewart and in terms of better understanding the narrative?
I have a quote from Dan's book. Do you mind if I jump in?
Please.
I confess I did see that. And when the existing script was given to Samuel Taylor, he didn't care for it. He thought it was very illogical. And I'm going to quote the book here. In their first meeting at Hitchcock's Paramount office, Taylor recalls, he told the director how he felt about the screenplay. Hitchcock told Taylor, "Well, to be honest, it's unshootable, and that's why I asked you to come. Jimmy Stewart won't do it." "We had a talk," said Taylor, "and I said, the first thing we have to do is make these people real." He said, "That's what Jimmy Stewart said." "The whole story," Taylor continued, "is so unreal and so fantasized that you never touch reality at all. Therefore, I have to create somebody who is completely in the real world, who can test you, this man, so you can come back to reality and say to the audience, is this the real world?" Taylor described what he wanted to do, and Hitchcock said, "Fine, go ahead and do it." So that's what I know about that.
Hi, thank you once again for a fantastic presentation. I have a million and one things I'd like to say, which I know I don't have time, but I just want to bring out one thing in the photography that was such a no-no, but here it worked so well, is when she comes to give Jimmy Stewart that thank you note, and she's wearing the white coat with the black scarf and black, how she's photographed in front of the white wall, which usually does not work, but the shadows and the lighting just made it an exquisite scene, really. So that really blew my mind. A question. Midge is obviously very much in love with Scotty. Right at the beginning of the movie, he mentions, yes, we were engaged once, weren't we? And you broke it off. I always wondered, why did Midge break it off? I don't know if there is an answer, but that was a little, screwy.
It's one
I'm
of
not a
those
big
things.
fan of the dialogue in that
Yeah.
scene. It's a
Yeah.
little too cutesy exposition for me, but
Right.
where were you for 3 whole days? Oh, those college days.
Yeah. It could have been something, something like that. But to me, like a lot was spoken of about control. And to me, this was more about obsession than
Yeah.
it was control. I don't think he was trying to control her. I just think he was obsessed with Madeline and could not control himself about that. So obsession and guilt, he had tremendous guilt about the wife's death and, of course, the man's death who was trying to save him and who died. So he had tremendous problems with that. And as far as the, plausibility, I think Hitchcock was going more for suspense than he was reality. I mean, The Bird certainly wasn't reality, and many of his other films. And he used much often he used backdrops. He would go on location, take the wide angle shot and superimpose it, behind James Stewart and Kim Novak. The rear projection was the street. And in the street, you don't see anybody walking. You don't see any cars moving. It's kind of like Hitchcock telling you it's only a movie. And it's kind of like the whole thing at first is a hoax. And he's kind of telling you it's a hoax, people. It's a hoax. Anyway, I think I have much more, but as I say, I think I've used my time. But this was a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Marjorie. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
sharing.
May I say,
Russell?
there's so many interpretations of the film, and one person who's close to the Hitchcock family and has written a great deal about him, his own feeling about Vertigo is that Jimmy Stewart never does come off that roof at the end, that he actually falls and dies, and the rest is kind of a dream and a post-life kind of, dare I say, spoiler alert, Sixth Sense kind of experience where this is anyway. But I think it's a movie that opens itself to all sorts of wonderful interpretations. And if not that there will be any lull in the discussion here, but before we're done, I'd love to read a few of the titles Paramount tried to convince Hitchcock to
Thank
use.
you.
But of course, back to questions.
Go for it.
Okay, Russell, you want to start your video and unmute? There you go. Hi, Russell.
Hello, Russell.
Hi, I had a comment and a question. The comment was, I didn't have any problem with the age difference between Kim Novak and Jimmy Stewart. It was sort of the same situation, wasn't that they said about To Catch a Thief with Grace Kelly and
Yes,
Cary
I
Grant was
was
the
gonna say
same
that.
difference. And I found that age difference also added to the unsettling nature of their relationship. It just added that one more little odd bit to their relationship. And my question was, I read this in a review. It didn't make sense to me, but perhaps it will to you. And it said, Hitchcock uncharacteristically uses several process shots. His intentional choice renders sections of the film obvious fabrications, conceived without his standard unblemished use of believable mise en scene. Now, I don't know what all that means, but
Mise en scène.
okay,
Yeah,
there you go.
French term.
I'd say that's true of
And
Marnie,
I
but
wondered
not
if any
this
of you
film
agreed
for
with
me.
that. I'm sorry?
I just say I think that's true of Marnie, a later film, but not the case for me on Vertigo. That is that the process work is subpar. I think it's excellent actually for its
Yeah,
time.
I would agree.
it seemed quite wonderful to me, but I'm certainly not a film expert. Yeah, the only other comment I said was one of them said that in this film, every frame is a painting, and I thought to me that was a pretty good way to describe a good bit of the film.
Damon, you want to unmute and start your video?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone.
Welcome.
I should introduce Damon. He is my nephew, and he's going to tell us about an experience he had on campus at Cornell a couple of months ago.
Yeah, exactly. So, I saw Vertigo for the first time, actually this past Halloween. It was like one of the horror movie features that the cinema was putting together. And something that I thought was like particularly, I don't know whether it was just due to the age of the film, but at the very beginning, the audience, who was all like 20, 21, 22, they all, with the first dolly zoom, like everyone kind of burst into laughter, which I think that Steven and Max, you guys were kind of talking about I guess modern horror films, right? They really lean on CGI and music in order to evoke emotion. But I found it was really interesting as this movie, like as this film progresses, that laughter like is pretty much instantly gone.
Steven, did you want to give us some other titles?
Very briefly, would you
Please.
prefer that Vertigo had one of the following titles suggested by Paramount Pictures? Afraid to Love, Alone in the Dark, The Apparition, Checkmate, Conscience, Cry from the Rooftop, Deception, Don't Leave Me, The Face Variations.
That's my favorite.
Yeah. Tonight is Ours. That sounds like a Lubitsch movie. Two Kinds of Women, The Witness, and there's a whole page of those, to which Hitchcock said, no, 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 it's Vertigo.
I have one final comment from me, which is, I don't know if I'll ever write this, but I think there is an opportunity for some SNL writer to create a sketch where we listen in on Gavin Elster trying to explain his plot to Judy Barton and trying to convince her that it will really work. One day I'll write that. Maybe we can do it here on New Plaza. I don't know.
As a
We
buddy
could
of mine once commented, what was in it for her?
Right. A lot of money, I hope.